Hi, everybody. This is Ratnabandhu, and I am speaking to Satyadana in Seattle. Hi, Satyadana.
Hi, Ratnabandhu. Thanks for doing this.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure. So, what this is a conversation that we're going to have for the next 50 minutes. And it's one of three conversations that we planned. And in the conversations, we're going to explore an article which you wrote 3 or 4 months ago
Hmm.
called, 3 or 4 months ago, called Understanding Pratichet Samutpada. So I found the article personally very, very useful. And that's one of the main reasons that I'm interviewing you. The article, although, as you described it yourself, is dense, it's 16 pages long, I think, in my printout. That includes a page or two of footnotes. And it's dense, but the distinctions in it are very, very simple. You've made some very, very simple uh, dharmic distinctions as far as I'm concerned, which personally brought a lot of clarity to my practice. And I've got a lot out of it in terms of understanding my own psyche and decreasing my tendency to create suffering for myself. So that's one reason why I'm interviewing you, because I'd like to get what you have to say out there. And one way of getting what you have to say out there is by audio and visual means, because not everybody is a reader, but many people can absorb and learn material just by listening. So it's a way of getting you to explain and expand verbally what you've written. And the third reason I thought I would interview you is just to put a face and a voice to Satyadana. You've written a few articles at this stage, so folks, this is Satyadana, a man that's been prolifically writing about the Dharma for the last, it's 3 years or so, at
Yes.
least. Yeah, and immersing himself, from the sounds of it, in a very extensive Pali Canon. So, as well as Chinese translations of various sutras and the Prajna Paramita, I think. I heard you talk about it 6 months ago by Edwin Wenz, or Edwin Konza. Was it Konza? Yeah.
Cons, yes.
Yeah, Konza. So you're very much steeped in the Dharma. So the interview, the article, as I said, it's quite a dense article. So the way that we decided to divvy it up, it's in 6 sections. So we're going to take 1 or 2 sections a night, and that'll be 3 interviews. And this evening, I'd like the main focus to be something that most of us are familiar with, the 3 lakshanas. We're going to go into them in some detail. A very clear clarification of what exactly they are and why they're important and what sort of impact that understanding can have on where you put the focus of your practice. Because if you misunderstand them, you could be focusing over here. And actually, it would be a bit better if you shifted your focus to here. So understanding the lakshanas. And we will just let the conversation unfold. So I'm going to ask you just a couple of questions before we get into the lakshanas. The first one is, could you give a bird's eye view of our perspective on what the article is about? Tell me what understanding Pratichet Samutpada is about in a few words, please.
It's appreciating what that term, Pratichet Samutpada, which is sometimes translated as dependent arising or conditioned co-production, what does that apply to? And also, what doesn't it apply to? If it doesn't apply to everything, what does that mean?
Okay.
So it's a matter of of trying to discern where Paticca Samuppada, which is clearly an important aspect of the Buddhist teachings as they've come down to us. How do you use that?
Okay, so that's a very rich response. Let's just hold that, because we'll get into the details of what Paticca Samuppada is. That's a whole section in the article. So hopefully people have got a broad sense. Maybe you could just say you're comparing Paticca Samuppada, one type of causality, to another type of causality. This was an important distinction for me. So what two types of causality are you comparing in the article?
I'm comparing what I refer to as everyday causality, where, as we typically see them, things rise and fall based on causes and conditions. It's something that you can't make dinner or get across the street and not accept that at a certain level that is true. There's also what I would offer is the sort of causality described by Paticca Samuppada, which has to do with, based on the cause or condition of ignorance or greed, hatred, and delusion, how is that you see those things, such as the dinner you're making, the cars that are preventing you from crossing the street, and so forth? How is your perception of what appears in everyday experience influenced?
Okay. All right. So the everyday causality that you mentioned first, what's the Sanskrit word for that you were using in the article?
One of the words I used was upanissa.
Upanissa. Okay.
Right. Another word that you can use is paticca.
Praticca.
Or praticca in Sanskrit.
Okay.
Paticca is Pali. It just means condition.
Okay. Righty-ho. So there's the conditions of cooking your dinner and making and crossing the street. You've got to understand those conditions. They're everyday. The causes of a dinner, or you get the potatoes, you get the veggies. These are the background. In dependence upon these conditions, a dinner will emerge. That's everyday causality. Is that correct?
That's a good illustration, yes.
Yeah, okay. So that's everyday causality. It's rational, it's reasonable. We're actually getting into it a little bit, so let's just make the basic distinction. So that's upanissa. That is universal?
Universal at the level of, what you might call conventional reality.
Yeah, most people understand it. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So Paticca Samuppada, on the other hand, is something much more specific, a description of the conditions out of which dukkha arises.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very, very specific. Okay, so I think that'll do at this stage. So the distinction between making your dinner, causality, it's dependent upon conditions, and then the conditions that out of which dukkha arises. They're two very distinct understandings. Is that correct?
Yes, that's how I presented it.
Yeah, okay. So we'll get into that in another evening, just discussing that and the implications of that. Okay, so that's presumably one broad reason why you wrote the article, to make that distinction. All right, so let's move on to another question. Why did you write the article, Satchidana? Here's why I asked that. You said in the article that I don't have the exact quote. Oh, I do have the exact quote. You said that what I present may seem unfamiliar, controversial, or perhaps even offensive. Why on earth would you write something that is potentially offensive or controversial?
Yes, the words I used there were fairly carefully chosen. The reason I wrote the article in general is to help facilitate the cessation of suffering. What I've experienced in talking with many others, what they've experienced is that the way we have come to understand Paticca Samutpada within Triratna is, I would offer, leading us in a different direction than the cessation of suffering. To question or to offer a different perspective on teachings which many people, in some cases, have learned and gone by for decades. I can understand that my article would be received as being very challenging, perhaps even offensive. So I wanted to acknowledge that my article, I had no illusion that it would be just received as just another article that was written. People will find it and have found it quite challenging. However, because of, you might say, the stakes involved, the cessation of suffering, in the end, that's why I nevertheless chose to write and publish it.
Okay. Let me touch upon something here. Presumably, one of the reasons that it's potentially controversial and offensive is that it contradicts what Sangharakshita states. It contradicts what Sangharakshita states. So that is a controversial thing to do in the context of the Triratna.
Yes, and I fully appreciate that's the case.
Yeah, okay.
Well, one thing I would say is that some people have assumed that I am seeking to dismiss Sangharakshita, or as one person put it, trying to create a Sangharakshita-sized hole in the Triratna Sangha. And that's simply not the case. For one thing, I don't think anyone could do that. He is the founder of the order and the community. What he has said and taught and did are indelible influences. There's just no way you can remove him from Triratna. It's more a matter of stepping back and looking, in this case, at what he taught and seeing if that is in fact consistent with what the Buddha taught or not. It doesn't dismiss or invalidate the many other things that he's taught that people have found very valuable, that I've found very valuable. This article is focused on really a rather narrow focus. However, what it does focus on obviously has fairly broad implications.
One thing that you said there that I just want to pick up on a little bit is that your article is, the background for you was the cessation of suffering, presumably to help people who are practicing to bring their suffering to an end. I'm just not sure, but could you expand on how that contrasts with what Sangharakshita has presented? Because presumably he would have the same intention to help people decrease the amount of suffering in their life. So how does what you're saying differ from what Sangharakshita says? Is the extent that the suffering can be alleviated, or what's your sense of that?
Well, I should say up front that I don't disagree at all that Sangharakshita's intent was also to help people experience the cessation of suffering. I don't ask or insist that people agree with how I describe my own experience of that. You and I did some interviews last year where I described experiences. What I experienced about 3-4 years ago was the cessation of paticca samuppada, the cessation of the perception that causality of any sort, whether you call it paticca samuppada, upanisa, or whatever, it ceased to be a believable description of what's happening. It was clearly a conceptual overlay. I realized that conditionality and causality couldn't be a descriptor, for example, that the Buddha would have used to describe his own awakening, at least at the conceptual level, because the experience of conditionality falls away. It was then that I started to look back in canonical literature, primarily in the Pali Canon, but also in the Mahayana literature, and realized that one could read that literature from that perspective, that the perception of conditionality and rise and fall and so forth as an explanation for the way things really are does in fact cease. It was then I realized that I did disagree with how paticca samuppada has been presented within Triratna.
Okay. So what you're saying there, I think, is paticca samuppada, i.e. the second type of causality that we were talking about, i.e. the conditions out of which suffering arises, they ceased. So suffering did not arise because the conditions for the suffering just weren't there. Nonetheless, upanisa, or everyday conditionality, what's your perspective on that? And what happened with that understanding of that things arise in dependence upon conditions? Is that not true in your experience?
I realized that in everyday terms, things that arise and fall in time and space is an interpretation. It's a conceptual overlay. It doesn't mean that that conceptual overlay is no longer possible. It's more a matter of realizing that it is, in fact, a conceptual overlay. It doesn't describe the way things really are, or a world in which things that are rising and falling are just there to be noticed or perceived.
Okay. I think this might be a good place to step into the three lakshanas.
Sure.
As descriptors of... Yeah, tell us about the three lakshanas. What are they?
As I've come to, well, the three lakshanas in Pali are anicca, which is often translated as impermanence. It's dukkha, which is often translated as suffering or unsatisfactoriness. And anatta, unsubstantiality, is typically it's one of the ways to translate it. They're descriptors of, in the case of impermanence and suffering, they're descriptors of conditioned existence.
Is that paticca samuppada or an upanisa?
It is, if you see things through the lens of paticca samuppada, things are conditioned and you will see them as impermanent and liable to suffering. So it's connected with paticca samuppada, those first two. Anatta, or the insubstantiality of things, applies to everything, whether you've conditioned your experience or not. For example, you'll always see, well, this is a green coffee cup. I'm not sure if it comes out green. You'll always see cups, whether you've conditioned your experience through via paticca samuppada or not. But once you have stopped conditioning your experience through ignorance or through greed, hatred, and delusion, the perception of impermanence as the way things really are, or things at all, stops. And what you perceive is no longer a possible source of suffering or dukkha. It's just a green cup.
It's just a green cup. Okay, and so the green cup, can the green cup be described as impermanent?
It could be in a conventional way. Obviously, if I take a hammer to it, it will no longer be a cup. It probably came from clay or some other ceramic that was fired and painted and glazed. All that is absolutely true, but the perception of it as a thing that is in fact impermanent, that's no longer, eventually that's no longer the perception of the way it is. So for example, if you just look at this cup.
Are you asking us to do this exercise now?
Yeah. I mean, I'm asking, is this cup visibly changing?
You can ask me them. Let's just do the exercise if that's
yes, okay. Right. So
you can follow along at home.
Yeah. So is this cup visibly changing in your what might be called direct experience?
Okay, let's have a look at it. Is it visibly changing? No, I can't see it visually changing, but I know when you take it down out of my visual field, it'll change. It'll be put on the table.
Right. But in your direct experience of it, there's nothing changing. You have to think about, well, it could change if I take a hammer to it.
Yeah, it could change. Yeah, okay. In my direct experience of it, no, I can't actually see it now. So I have no direct experience of it now. So I don't know anything about it now. Yeah.
Right. And you can think about everything else, was created. It's composite in nature. It was made from certain materials. Nothing lasts forever.
Yeah, okay.
So in an everyday sense, things are, subject to change, but it has to, that's what happens when you start to think about it. Okay. If you just look at it, it's not changing at all.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah. And in a way, I think it would be helpful to translate anicca as non-permanence, as opposed to impermanence. If you talk about impermanence of this cup, then you're starting to talk about an inherent quality. Whereas I think a better approach would be to say that, no, it's just not permanent. If you're looking for permanence or reliability, predictability in something, you're not going to find it. It doesn't mean you find the opposite of impermanence. And in fact, if you stop conditioning your experience to try and find permanence, predictability, and so forth, you'll never be disappointed. You'll never see impermanence either. You'll see just things as they are.
Okay.
Which again, you can always think about and say, well, yes, at a conventional level, it will change. I will eventually drop this cup, for example.
Yeah. I get that. Can we go into that a little bit more deeper? In a little bit more detail?
Regarding permanence and impermanence?
Technical action of impermanence.
Right. So
can I ask you a couple of questions about it?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
All right. So, excuse me. Say I'm the seeker coming along to you as Buddhist practitioner, and you all want to explain to me how you want to explain reality. It's probably not the best word, but are you saying that when you pick up the cup, that the reality of this cup is not permanent. We think it's permanent, but it's not permanent. That is actually the reality of the cup. Is that
Right.
yeah?
Yeah,
Okay.
we look for permanence
Yeah.
and predictability and so forth, but we just can't find it.
Okay. And that leads to suffering when we are looking for permanence and we can't find it.
Right. What I suggest is not to then try to, you might say, impose the opposite of impermanence or the opposite of permanence and say, well, then it is impermanent. If it's not
Ah,
one, it has to be the other.
okay. All right. So are you saying that impermanence is not a descriptor of reality with a capital R?
Yes. It
Okay.
is a descriptor of what you see if you're looking for permanence and don't find it.
Okay. So Sangharakshita says that reality is characterized by the lakshanas. Reality
Yes.
is characterized by impermanence, by insubstantiality, and by the other one, I can't remember what it is, unsatisfactoriness.
Yes.
So he's saying that reality is characterized by that. That's a piece of dharma which you're presenting in contradiction to what he's saying. Is that correct? You're saying one thing, and Sangharakshita is saying the other thing, and they're quite different.
Yes, they are quite different, but
Okay.
that is what I'm saying.
Okay, so that is one of the controversial things that you were saying in the paper. Sangharakshita has gone on for the last 40 years about reality being impermanent, unsatisfactory, and insubstantiality, and you're saying, no, that is not true. And what you're saying is true is reality cannot be described with those characteristics. In fact, it can't be described with any characteristics. Is that correct?
I would say that the perception of permanence or impermanence eventually falls away,
Yeah.
and that you don't see either of them. It's like the issue never, eventually never comes up because neither permanence nor impermanence have any bearing on what's happening. Similarly, if you stop looking to always feel good, that things will always go good.
Okay.
You won't experience suffering either. You don't place that condition or expectation on what's happening. So whether something is satisfactory or unsatisfactory, sukha or dukkha in Pali, that what you might call dualistic distinction goes away as well.
Okay.
What's left is you can still recognize green coffee cups or laptop screens, but there's not the assumption that it's anything substantial or that it's any distinct thing at all.
Okay.
There's just
So
and
Upanishad
so
continues.
and Upanishad also continues. You can appreciate how at a conventional level this laptop screen that I'm looking at was created from thermoplastics. I can understand how the pixels on the screen can be called image of Ratnabandhu and so forth. That mode of conditionality or causality can always be recognized. At some point, though, you realize that it is in fact an interpretation.
Even that's an
And
interpretation.
yeah, and not the way things really are.
Okay. So could you bring us through what you understand Sangharakshita says as to the way things are and the way that you are describing the way things are? And then I'd like to ask you, where are you getting your evidence of all of that in terms of scriptural reference or maybe personal experience. So could you just compare, say, tell us what your understanding of what Sangharakshita um, talks about when he talks about the way things are?
My understanding is that the way things are, if you use concepts and terms, the fundamental way the Buddha talked about it was in terms of paticca samuppada. It's my understanding that Sangharakshita believes that the Buddha described his own awakened experience in terms of understanding paticca samuppada. That the Buddha saw things in terms of impermanence, susceptibility to suffering, and insubstantiality. That was, again, if you use words and concepts, that is how the Buddha fundamentally described that experience of awakening. So in terms of the Lakshanas, one can look around and see how everything has arisen and will eventually fall based on causes and conditions. Therefore, it cannot have any substance to it, both in terms of it being composite in nature and having arisen based on causes and conditions. And also that nothing around us, regardless of the orientation or how you sequence it, it just can't bring lasting happiness. So it's, as I understand it, Sangharakshita's presentation is based on paticca samuppada as the way things rise and fall based on conditions, almost in a spatio-temporal sense, very much a causal sense. And that's why the three lakshanas apply not just to everything that's conditioned, but to everything at all.
Okay. And what are the implications of that? Like, to understand paticca samuppada in that universal way, like, why is that important in terms of implication?
One implication is that if you go into the spiritual life, as it were, believing that, for example, impermanence describes the way things really are, then you will continually affirm that perspective. You'll always look for impermanence in everything. You won't see why it is you see things as impermanent to begin with. You just won't question that. As I alluded to earlier, at some point you don't see things as impermanent anymore. You don't see things, or you don't see time and space in which things might rise and fall. So by affirming impermanence, you're affirming a quality or a descriptor of what you see that is based on a mental interpretation, and as opposed to the way things really are.
Okay. And what about unsatisfactoriness? Affirming unsatisfactoriness, I guess?
The difference, I would say, is Sangharakshita suggests that the way to approach the Lakshana of dukkha is to see that no particular arrangement of what you see can bring lasting happiness. But it seems implicit in that is that there's always the potential for dukkha. There's always the potential for suffering. I would offer that there comes a point where it doesn't matter what is happening, what the arrangement of people, phenomena, things. It doesn't matter what's happening. Dukkha simply can no longer arise.
Okay. That might be a hard one for people to get their heads around. I'm not sure. Okay. That's
Yeah.
understandable.
And then in terms of anatta or insubstantiality, however you'd like to translate it, I would offer that it's a difference of saying that things are anatta because they are composite in nature, or because they are impermanent, or because they rise and fall based on conditions. That's different than no longer assuming that anything has any substance to it. So you no longer have to remind yourself that things are insubstantial, for one reason or another, because you don't superimpose substance. You don't assume that things are substantial in the first place.
Hmm. Okay. The three actions seem so primary and I suppose unconscious as well. Like we come to the world projecting permanence or wanting permanence, satisfactoriness, etc. So they feel like hard to access and work with. But what you're talking about is bringing some more consciousness to them. Okay, bloody hell. So you mentioned before that the lakshanas are not descriptors of reality, but they're more, I can't remember the exact words you use, but they're more balancers, they're more like contrary in tendency.
Yeah, they're correctives or reminders.
Yeah, correctives. Could you talk about that, how they're really not descriptors of reality, but correctives of some sort? Could you go into that, please?
Yes. We condition our experience, for example, to expect that we'll find permanence. And we want predictability. We want to know how we're going to feel. We want to know what things are. That's what we want. In terms of permanence and things staying the same, we never find that. And so it's as if we have to constantly remind ourselves what you're looking for is not there.
Okay, can I halt you for a second there?
Mm-hmm.
So when you're talking about the person who is doing that, you're not talking about a beginner, are you? You're talking about someone who might have got into the spiritual life 20, 30 years ago, with a normal sort of mindset. I have come to the Dharma looking for satisfactoriness, looking for satisfactoriness, but probably unconsciously looking for permanence, looking for substantiality. And that has been not questioned, but affirmed by Sangharakshita, that he hasn't said question that. Are things substantial? Are things unsatisfactory? Are things impermanent? Question it. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, he hasn't offered an inquiry into those primary ways of understanding.
I would say I would say that it applies to everyone.
Yes.
Probably by the time we're 2 or 3 years old, we have a sense that things are what they are, and we look for permanence and predictability in our lives.
Yeah. Okay.
And of course, we never find that. Things change, people change.
Yeah. Okay.
Events happen, and it's like we don't really have to remind ourselves that permanence is not available, because life offers reminders of that. Day in, day out.
And how are the correctives then? So how are the lakshanas merely correctives and not descriptors of reality? Could you bring us through
that? So in the case of anicca, if you translate it as non-permanence, then what you're reminding yourself is that you're looking for permanence and you don't find it.
You're looking for permanence and you don't find it. So you're reminding yourself, but you're not reminding yourself that things are impermanent.
Right. So it's quite another thing to then go to its opposite, saying, well, if I don't find permanence, then impermanence must be an inherent quality of what I perceive. But if you just left it as, well, I don't find permanence, then just leave it at that and don't assume that the opposite must be true.
And what are you left with then, if you can't go to the opposite?
Well, you, again, at the conventional level, you're left with, well, sure, things rise and fall conventionally based on causes and conditions, but you don't have to experience things in that way as either permanent or impermanent. I think it's clearer if we look at the second lakshana of dukkha.
Okay. Yeah.
So we're, again, by the time we're quite young, we come to expect that life at least can be satisfying. We can feel good, if we just try and get all the right conditions together, if we have enough money, if we have enough toys, depending on your age. It seems like we come to believe, well, this should be possible. Life should be sukha. It should go well, which is one way of literally translating that word. What we find, though, is that, well, at least sometimes, maybe a lot of times, life is dukkha. It doesn't go the way we want. But if you say that, well, that means that reality is susceptible, or we're liable to suffering no matter what, the possibility is always there, then I would offer you've precluded the possibility of awakening. The Buddha didn't say, well, I don't suffer anymore because certain conditions are in place, or of where I live or what I eat and so forth. If dukkha were a descriptor of the way things really are, then one would still have to live carefully in order to not suffer, as opposed to suffering no longer even being a possibility.
Okay, right. So suffering is not part of reality.
Right.
Okay.
Suffering comes about because we place unrealistic conditions or expectations on what is happening.
Okay. And if you don't place unrealistic conditions upon it, you're not arguing with it.
Yeah, there's no resistance to
it. So it just
what's
is
happening.
what it is.
Yeah.
And that is reality. It is what it is.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, it's really kind of a trite phrase. Well, things just are what they are.
Yeah.
But I think there's some truth to it. There's a lot of truth to it.
Yeah. Well, most people are unconsciously fighting against reality. There's some level of them is thinking this shouldn't be happening. That's terrible.
Yeah.
But it's not actually. It's just a little epiphenomena happening in their head. Nothing to do with reality particularly, which is just sitting there.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me ask you something related to that, and we're coming up to 50 minutes, so we'll go for another 5 minutes or so. So in your article, you wrote something else controversial as well. So I'm just going to get it down here.
Okay.
So Sangharakshita says that the Buddha needed to revere the Dharma in order to, he needed to revere the Dharma, and you're saying that this is not true. So again, controversial. Could you go into that, please? Why did the Buddha, despite it being talked about in the sutra, that he was sitting there revering the Dharma because he had to revere something?
Right. So in the Gaurava Sutta, it actually and there's another account of it as well, by, I suppose, another name. But when the Buddha first awoke, he said that I see no one that I can revere. And it's painful not to revere on someone or something. So since there's no one to rely upon, I will rely upon the Dharma that I have just realized. My understanding of how Sangharakshita interprets that is that the Buddha would have continued to need to rely upon or revere the Dharma in order to not suffer.
In order to not suffer. Okay.
Right. Because
so
with the
suffering was conditional. Yeah, okay.
Right. And what I would offer is that, well, for one thing, that is the only time the Buddha said that. It doesn't show up again in his teaching that he talks about he himself relying upon the Dharma or revering the Dharma so he doesn't suffer. My speculation, one possibility is that he was used to revering and relying upon somebody or something, perhaps culturally conditioned to assume that will always be the case. But he got to the point where he realized that he couldn't do that anymore because looking around, he didn't see anyone that he could revere. So he assumed that, well, I need to revere somebody or something, so I'll rely or revere the Dharma instead. One possibility, again, is that was his assumption going into the experience of awakening, but he learned that really wasn't the case, that he didn't have to continue to revere or rely upon the Dharma for him to no longer suffer. He just didn't suffer any longer.
Mm. Okay. And when you say he learned, I mean, are you just saying, well, it didn't appear in the sutras again, therefore?
Right. It's undeniable that he said that's the thought that he had upon awakening.
Yeah.
However, in all of the canonical literature that I've read, I've never seen him mention that again in terms of his own experience.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe, I mean, you say that maybe it's like that time when he had the thought, the Dharma is too subtle and complex to teach people. And then he only mentioned that once, but then he actually got on and
yes. Yeah. Thankfully, he changed his mind about that.
Yeah. Okay. So he said something one day, and then there's never
right. He's sitting there in what may be called the disorientation of awakening.
Yeah. Thinking,
wow, I don't have anything or anyone to revere. I also have no idea how I'm going to tell anyone about this.
Yeah. Right. Okay. All very understandable. Okay. Right. So I think we'll just finish it there on this evening's conversation. I mean, there's something connected to that, but I'll make a note of it and we'll touch into it. That whole ongoing revere-ness that suggests that there's no end to the path. There's an ongoingness that happens. The Buddha has merely disappeared over the horizon, but there was a forward momentum, etc., etc. So we'll go into that on another occasion.
Okay, and one thing I would like to add is that I'm not saying that a sense of reverence is not valuable or is not important. I'm not saying that at all. I know for many people it is in fact important. There are different. It's probably necessary.
Yeah.
I would offer that it's not important or necessary for everyone.
Yeah.
And that to say that the Buddha's escape from suffering still had conditions or strings attached, to my mind, says, well, he didn't really overcome suffering.
Yeah.
That he still had to have a response to something.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And in addition, I would say that him, wanting to revere, I mean, that was an example of upanisa, of everyday conditions. Like, so we all know that the spiritual life is dependent upon certain conditions. And so Sangharakya was saying, well, one condition that's absolutely necessary is a sense of reverence. And you're saying, no, actually, it's not. Of course, you can have it, but it's not absolutely essential. Spiritual life can happen very well without it. In fact, it's actually not necessary to become an awakened being.
Right. I wouldn't say it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah, it's not absolutely necessary. For some types, it's gorgeous and it's beautiful and
right. And for them, it may in fact be necessary.
Yeah,
I just don't think it's a universal.
For them, it might be the way of the heart, and great.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's leave it here, and thank you so much for sharing this evening.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And we will meet again in maybe a couple of weeks' time, and we'll take another section. Perhaps we will go into the difference between pratitya, samappada, the conditions from which specific suffering emerges, compared to aparanisa, which is the everyday conditions out of which the spiritual life arises, etc. And the eggs are scrambled. Toast. Okay, so good night.
Yes.